Anything you dream is fiction, and anything you accomplish is science. The whole history of mankind is nothing but science fiction. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 14 of season 8, and we are introducing another Master of Horror miniseries, this time all about Ray Bradbury.
That opening quote that Matt read us about science fiction and the history of mankind was, of course, from Ray Bradbury himself. So I'm going to do a little bit of a rundown of his biography. I won't go into everything, but just a little bit. So he was an American author. He was also a screenwriter. He was born in 1920 in Illinois. Apparently, his family moved around a bit, and he lived in Tucson, Arizona for a good bit of his childhood, but he eventually attended Los Angeles High School, where he was very active in the drama club. And so that kind of, I think, got him into the Hollywood lifestyle. Apparently, one of the things he really liked to do when he was in high school was roller skate through Hollywood in hopes of meeting celebrities and just kind of getting among the creative people. He got his first payment as a writer at the age of 14 when he sold a joke to George Burns, which he then used on the Burns and Allen radio show. One of the other things he was incredibly fascinated with, as beyond, writing and I guess roller skating through Hollywood, was carnivals. And apparently, there was a very formative event in his youth. I'm just going to read you what he wrote because I think it goes into a lot of his works, and particularly The Illustrated Man and Something Wicked This Way Comes. But he talks about on Labor Day weekend in 1932, he would have been 12 years old at this time. He went to go see this show that was being advertised for a Mr. Electrico. And apparently it was a performer that was sitting in an electric chair, and a stagehand pulled a switch, and he was charged with 50,000 volts of pure electricity. Now, this is the quote from Bradbury himself. Lightning flashed in his eyes, and his hair stood on end. I sat below in the front row, and he reached down with a flaming sword full of electricity, and he tapped me on both shoulders and then the tip of my nose, and he cried, "Live forever." And I thought, God, that's wonderful. How do you do that? So when I left the carnival that day, I stood by the carousel and I watched the horses running around and around to the music of beautiful Ohio, and I cried. Tears streamed down my cheeks because I knew something important had happened to me that day because of Mr. Electrico. I felt changed. And so I went home, and within days, I started to write, and I never stopped. I think that's a pretty cool thing. And also, I will, just as a side note, that sounds terrifying. I'm glad he found it wonderful. It sounds like a terrifying show to have watched. And it really reminds me of the Stephen King book Revival, which I think is kind of Bradbury by way of Stephen King. Like that book, I don't know. We can talk about that later. But so apparently that was one of the things that prompted him to write. Another thing was movies. He really enjoyed going to the movies. In particular, his mother would take him to go see the movies, and he kind of saw that as magic. But he has a lot of influences that he lists: Robert Frost, William Shakespeare, John Steinbeck, Thomas Wolfe, apparently Eudora Welty. So that's a nice Southern connection there. But he's known for a lot of his work. I would say his writing, even though he's really well known for fantasy and science fiction, kind of crosses genres a lot. He's best known for Fahrenheit 451. and several different short story collections, including the Martian Chronicles, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, the Illustrated Man, the Veldt, the October Country, and of course, Something Wicked This Way Comes. He also wrote several, or at least consulted on several screenplays and television scripts, including Moby Dick and It Came from Outer Space. And of course, many of his works were adapted, which again, I'm sure we'll talk about too. But that's just a little bit about the man himself. I'm going to throw it over to Matt or Mel so that we can share some of our favorite Bradbury reads, or maybe adaptations even. So I'll let one of y'all take it away.
Well, I'll jump in first because I don't know if I've told y'all this story or not, or if I have, it's been a long time. You may not remember it, but I actually saw Ray Bradbury. He came to my hometown when I was in 8th grade and did kind of a lecture / talk about, writing and that sort of thing. And he actually told that Mr. Electrico story as part of the thing. I really remember that resonating with me because I was about the same age he was. I think I was about 12 as well. And sitting there, like, listening to this, like, stalwart of science fiction talking was just, I was in awe and entranced. And yeah, I got a paperback of Fahrenheit 451 signed and still have it. And I thought, I don't know, it was just a really cool experience. So as far as Bradbury's work goes, I mean, I know you mentioned Fahrenheit 451. That is probably his most well-known one. I think one of my favorites, it's kind of a toss-up between The Illustrated Man and The Martian Chronicles. I read The Martian Chronicles first, and I really loved the sci-fi of it, and in particular, the story that I remember the most was kind of an adaptation of Fall of the House of Usher, because they discover the House of Usher on Mars, but it's not actually the House of Usher per se. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to say beyond, his imagination is so incredible, and he has such a great gift of words and writing and description. And I really feel like he's very well known in the science fiction community, and a lot of his stuff definitely bleeds over into horror, especially like Something Wicked This Way Comes, or even a lot of his short stories definitely have a sinister edge to them. But yeah, I feel like he may not always get his due besides Fahrenheit 451, which seems to be like very common in the pop culture zeitgeist. So hopefully we can raise his image even further. But I'll turn it over to Mel to kind of jump in now if she'd like.
Sure. First off, I have to say, Matt, I don't know that you've ever told me that you saw Ray Bradbury and got his signature, and that is amazing, and I'm extremely jealous. As a fan of Bradbury, it would have been great to hear him talk like that when I was, especially at your age. Like the age you're at is kind of like perfect for meeting him as a writer.
Because he was coming, like, my 8th grade English teacher, we actually did a whole unit on his work, and that was where I first read The Martian Chronicles, was in 8th grade in preparation for him coming. And I don't remember what all else we did, but we definitely did stuff in school just around the fact that he was coming. And so I definitely, like, I talked my parents into, I was like, I have to go see him. This is Ray Bradbury. When will we ever get a chance like this again? And thankfully they agreed.
That is so cool. Yeah, so it's really hard for me to pick hard and fast favorites. I think I'll talk a little bit, I guess, of my really early experiences with Bradbury. And Lisa, I think I might mention one of the things that you have in your list, but I'm not going to say much about it so that you could explain, why you picked that particular one, which listeners We've talked about that particular book and movie before on this podcast. So you probably, if you've been listening for a while, know what it could be. I never got to meet Ray Bradbury, as I said, but I remember when I was in, I believe it was middle school, we had to read a story, There Will Come Soft Rains, which what a way to traumatize people in a middle school age. And There Will Come Soft Rains is the famous story of his about the kind of automated house. And I don't want to spoil it, I would say, but there's been a, let's say a kind of disaster, a very scary event has happened, we'll say. And the automatic house appears to, at the beginning of the story, just be kind of doing its thing without actual people in it. And of course, this kind of idea of an automatic home is something that recurs in Bradbury's fiction. But I will never forget, I don't think, turning to that story in the anthology that we had in that class and reading it. And it just stuck in my mind. And of course, I believe that one is in the Martian Chronicles. So it was just pulled from that book. My next experience with Ray Bradbury was probably, it was a toss up between two things. I've talked in other places about how when I was a little kid and I would stay at my grandparents' house, they listened to public radio and they would sometimes have these kind of classic radio programs. And that's how I listened to some of my first Poe stories. And a couple of the Martian Chronicles stories were on that program. And so that got me interested in the Martian Chronicles story when I was young. And then, of course, I read Fahrenheit 451 in high school, and I remember liking it. And then I kind of moved away from Bradbury, I guess, for a while. And then when I was older, I guess it was when I was in graduate school or just after, I read Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I was familiar with previously from the film. And that I feel like it might be my top Bradbury, just because I love the way he describes childhood and fall. I've since listened to it on audiobook in the fall because it just seems so perfect for that time period. The other thing I like of his work is October Country. All the stories are great and very fall like. And I've said on No Fear and the Monster She Wrote podcast that I like to reread it in the fall. But I think I would give a shout out to The Small Assassin, the creepy child story in October Country. The Scythe is pretty good in that one. And also The Emissary has a special place in my heart. It's a dog story that is heartwarming and sad and scary, like all in one. And I've read it a few times. And then I guess, the Halloween Tree for another fall vibe book would be a good one. But another story that sticks in my mind would be 0 Hour, which is in, I believe, the Illustrated Man. And I don't know if you remember this one, Matt, but it's another creepy kid one because all the kids in this neighborhood act like they have instructions to build something. And the parents are trying to figure out, like, if this is they think it's a game, but as the story goes on, it gets weirder and weirder as to what the kids are doing and what it could mean. And I believe it was like in the 2012, maybe around then, there was an attempt at an adaptation of 0 Hour, and I watched like the first episode, and I don't think it lasted very long. I assume it got one season. I cannot even remember the name of the show. I'd have to go look it up, but I didn't feel like watching the first couple episodes that it was like as good as the story, I guess. But yeah, so that's probably, I guess, not a super successful adaptation because I don't think it went beyond like maybe one season. But yeah, I agree with you, Matt. We think of Bradbury as a science fiction writer and a classic science fiction writer, but he got his start in Weird Tales magazine, which is where most of the stories in October Country come from. And there's a lot that's scary and uneasy and uncanny in his stories, which I think lends really well to that kind of fall vibe, creepy time vibe that people may be looking for. And there's so much out there by him too. Like I'm still reading stuff by Bradbury because I don't want it all to be gone, and I don't have anything left to read. So, Lisa, what are some of your favorites? I know you wanted to talk a bit more about adaptation.
Yeah, I feel like I definitely read Ray Bradbury, but I feel like I read Bradbury more as an adult. My first introduction was through film. So yeah, adaptation of his work is something that really meant a lot. The first thing I remember seeing, or that I connected with, that I knew this is a Ray Bradbury, was Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I feel like a lot of people our age that this was like one of the movies that really um stuck with us. It was a 19 so I'm gonna butcher these. If I remember right, it was um a 1983 film based on the 1962 book. I don't think I even realized it was a book at the time when I watched it. And there was also, I think, another adaptation in the 70s, but I've never seen that one. So I'm only talking about this one. But this one was a produced with Walt Disney, and I remember always seeing it around Halloween time. I'm assuming on the Disney Channel. I mean, I wasn't allowed to watch a whole lot of stuff when I was younger, but we kind of had free reign with the Disney Channel. And anybody who grew up in the 80s and like early 90s watching Disney, I think you remember like they had a pretty good grasp on horror for children. There was Something Wicked This Way Comes, which, I mean, just the idea of a carnival and then there, that's supposed to be such a fun thing, which I had no real idea either. I think at the time of like a traveling carnival actually was. I remember going to the state fair, and I think that was like the closest thing we had to it. But just this idea of something really exciting coming to your town, but harboring something so evil. And I know I've mentioned this before too, but that is one of the few jump scares, and I don't even know if you'd call it a jump scare. In my brain, I remember it being that, but it was the spiders in the movie crawling out. I just remember being so terrified by it, like so terrified by it. So he has this place in, at least when I look back at my childhood, in those kind of formative years of like really cementing what I enjoyed, this kind of like creepy Halloween type story. And then I didn't even realize this until later, but another one of my favorite movies, now this was more science fiction than like scary, but it was The Electric Grandmother, which I think we have talked about on this podcast. I want to say maybe we talked about it for the Patreon feed. I'm not entirely sure, but
Yeah, it was for our robot series, I believe.
that's right.
Yeah. And we did Something Wicked This Way Comes one summer, and I remember we were totally freaked out by the spiders on our rewatch.
Yeah, I still, even now talking about it, you can't see me because this is a podcast, but I was covering my face like as I was talking about it, because I just remember there being certain, so that was one of them. In Pee-wee's, in the movie, the Pee-wee Herman movie, when Large Marge, when her eyes bulge out, that was one of the like jump scares that really like stuck with me.
Yes,
That and
yes.
the spiders here. I'm laughing. It's still, I think I still have a hard time watching that. For some reason, it's like the scares you have as a child just just stick with you. But yeah, the other one I remember watching was The Electric Grandmother. And this was another, I think it was a made for TV movie. And so it came out in the early 80s. And I remember watching it I'm pretty sure maybe one of my grandparents had like taped it on VHS. And that's how I watched it so often, because I remember this one really well. But it has Maureen Stapleton, who plays this like robotic grandmother who comes to take care of these kids who've recently lost their mother. And it's a weird, like I said, it's one of those weird stories, because I did not realize it was a Ray Bradbury story until, again, I was an adult kind of looking back. But it's also this kind of, I think, strange story itself, in the way it came about, because apparently with the electric grandmother, so it's based on the story I Sing the Body Electric. And that was first written for the Twilight Zone in 1962, and then I think he wrote it into a story, which was which came out first in McCall's in that magazine, and then it was collected in 1969. I think it came out the same year in McCall's, maybe. But it's just interesting, I think, the way, like, going back and looking at that and how much he was thinking about television already. And that he wasn't just, a fiction writer in that. But the electric grandmother, I don't know why it was one of those stories that stuck to me when I was a kid. I just remember being fascinated by the factory that they go to. The children, if you haven't seen it, go to this factory and literally build a grandmother. Like, they pick out what color eyes she's gonna have, and like what kind of voice, like how she's gonna speak to them. And I do remember she kind of had like Inspector Gadget, like go Gadget um, limbs. She could pour hot chocolate out of one of her fingers just by like pointing. Of course, then she had to plug herself in at night, which was a little creepy. But she sat there in her rocking chair because she didn't sleep. But I just remember really connecting to that as a kid, and really loving that idea of kind of building your perfect like caretaker, and somebody who is like just there for you, and you're just like to take care of you and to give you, I guess, in my brain, like having hot cocoa shoot out of your hand just was perfect. It was a wish come true. But I do think that looking back on that, it really, I think, tells me some things about Ray Bradbury. Number one, the fact that he could write so well for adults and children. I don't think many authors have that ability to be able to really do that well, because his adult fiction obviously is equally as strong as his children's fiction. But then I also just think just the scope of his imagination, and I don't think there are many writers today who have that kind of imagination. And as we're going to talk about, so just to kind of give you listeners a sneak into what we're doing, next, for our next episode, we're going to read his short story, The Velt, which is, kind of creepy children plus AI. So a really fun story. And we're going to talk about it on the next episode. So you can go, if you want, and find the story. It's readily available on the internet, and it's widely collected as well. But if you want to read it before we do that episode, that would be great. But the way he could anticipate some of the things that we're dealing with today, with like the smart houses and artificial intelligence, and this idea of creating a reality, like an augmented reality too, which is something that we're really seeing come forward today. He was such an intelligent writer to be able to kind of see where society was going and predict some of that is really fascinating. I mean, he only passed away in 2012. So, but just to think that he was writing some of this stuff in, the 60s, the 70s, it's pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to raise. And I kind of want to reiterate what you said about how he could write for kids and adults kind of at the same time. I feel like when I saw the movie Something Wicked, probably on TV when I was a kid, I was probably, I was identifying with the kids and their fears. And then when I got to finally reading the book when I was older, when I was in my late 20s, I could have that nostalgia for the kids, but start to understand the older characters. And then when I listened to it in audiobook last year, and now I'm in my 40s, it hits me in a different way yet again. And so you don't lose the thoughts you had at the beginning when you were younger and you listened to the story or you read the story, but it's as an adult, it gives it like a whole new take, which I find so interesting that he was able to do that, to kind of almost recreate childhood in a way that works for all ages, and to describe adult characters that are dealing with adult issues. But yeah, and the visionary aspect of his work is really, really interesting to me as well. And his influence on writers who are writing now. I know, Lisa, you and I have talked about how we see so much of his influence on Kelly Link's stories, that kind of imaginative, freewheeling, kind of large S of her imagination and way of blending genres. I think of something like Aaron Morgenstern's The Night Circus. I don't know if he's an influence on it, but he definitely is a major force in ideas of using circuses, dark carnivals, that sort of thing. So I feel like his reach is a lot further and more multivariate than people think of today as well.
Well, Mel, Lisa, I really don't know that I have much more that I could add myself. I feel like you have both completely covered all of the ground that I would have as well. I mean, Bradbury's imagination is like I said at the beginning of the episode. It's just it's so fascinating and so deep, and I love where he goes with so many of his stories. And yeah, I don't really think that there is much more else to say at this point. As Lisa alluded to, we will be doing another Master of Horror episode on Bradbury. We're going to be discussing The Veld. So, listeners, if you are interested in reading that before we release our next episode, we would be happy to. We're happy to let you know that that's what we'll be doing. And if you have any comments or anything that you want to say to us either before that episode or after listening to our discussion of it, well, as we say at the end of every episode, we are at No Fearcast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page as well. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon or simply review us, which is entirely free. It helps other listeners find us. The theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.